Oops, we are at book 3 of a series of unfortunate events, The Wide Window. And this is going to be part 1. I'm going to read chapters 1 through 3. Yeah, just got to get to chapter 1. There's the picture. Chapter 1. If you didn't know much about the Baudelaire orphans, and you saw them sitting on their suitcases at Demicles dock, you might think that they were bound for an exciting adventure. After all, the 3 children had just disembarked from the fickle ferry, which had driven them across Lake Lachrymose to live with their Aunt Josephine, and in most cases such a situation would lead to thrillingly good times. But of course you would be dead wrong, for although Violet, Claus, and Sunny, Baudelaire, were about to experience events that would both be exciting and memorable, they would not be exciting and memorable like having your fortune told or going to a rodeo. Their adventure would be exciting and memorable like being chased by a werewolf through a field of thorny bushes at midnight with nobody around to help you. If you are interested in reading a story filled with thrillingly good times, I am sorry to inform you that you are most certainly reading the wrong book, because the Baudelaires experience very few good times over the course of their gloomy and miserable lives. It is a terrible thing, their misfortune, so terrible that I can scarcely bring myself to write about it. So if you do not want to read a story of tragedy and sadness, this is your very last chance to put this book down, because the misery of the Baudelaire orphans begins in the very next paragraph. "Look what I have for you," Mr. Poe said, grinning from ear to ear and holding out a small paper bag. "Peppermints." Mr. Poe was a banker who had been placed in charge of handling the affairs of the Baudelaire orphans after their parents died. Mr. Poe was kind-hearted, but it is not enough in this world to be kind-hearted, particularly if you are responsible for keeping children out of danger. Mr. Poe had known the 3 children since they were born, and could never remember that they were allergic to peppermints. "Thank you, Mr. Poe," Violet said, and took the paper bag and peered inside. Like most 14-year-olds, Violet was too well-mannered to mention that if she ate a peppermint, she would break out in hives, a phrase which here means be covered in red, itchy rashes for a few hours. Besides, she was too occupied with inventing thoughts to pay much attention to Mr. Poe. Anyone who knew Violet would know that when her hair was tied up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes, the way it was now, her thoughts were filled with wheels, gears, levers, and other necessary things for inventions. At this particular moment, she was thinking of how she could improve the engine of the fickle fairy so it wouldn't belch smoke into the gray sky. "That's very kind of you," said Claus, the middle Baudelaire child, smiling at Mr. Poe, and thinking that if he had even one lick of peppermint, his tongue would swell up and he would scarcely be able to speak. Claus took his glasses off and wished that Mr. Poe had bought him a book or a newspaper instead. Claus was a voracious reader, and when he had learned about his allergy at a birthday party when he was 8, he had immediately read all his parents' books about allergies. Even 4 years later, he could recite the chemical formulas that caused his tongue to swell up. "Toy!" Sunny shrieked. The youngest Baudelaire was only an infant, and like many infants, she spoke mostly in words that were tricky to understand. By toy, she probably meant, "I have never eaten a peppermint because I suspect that I, like my siblings, am allergic to them." But it is hard to tell. She may also have meant, "I wish I could bite a peppermint because I like to bite things with my 4 sharp teeth, but I don't want to risk an allergic reaction." "You can eat them on your cab ride to Miss Ann Whistle's house," Mr. Poe said, coughing into his white handkerchief. Mr. Poe always seemed to have a cold, and the Baudelaire orphans were accustomed to receiving information from him between bouts of hacking and wheezing. "She apologizes for not meeting you at the dock, but she says she's frightened of it." "Why would she be frightened of a dock?" Claus asked, looking around at the wooden piers and sailboats. "She's frightened of anything to do with Lake Lachrymose," Mr. Poe said, "but she didn't say why. Perhaps it has to do with her husband's death. Your Aunt Josephine, she's not really your aunt, of course. She's your second cousin's sister-in-law, but ask that you call her Aunt Josephine. Your Aunt Josephine lost her husband recently, and it may be possible that he drowned or died in a boat accident. It didn't seem polite to ask how she became a dowager. Well, Let's just put you in a taxi." "What does that word mean?" Violet asked. Mr. Poe looked at Violet and raised his eyebrows. "I'm surprised at you, Violet," he said. "A girl of your age should know that a taxi is a car which will drive you someplace for a fee. Now let's gather your luggage and walk to the curb." "Dowager," Claus whispered to Violet, "is a fancy word for widow." "Thank you," she whispered back, picking up her suitcase in one hand and Sunny in the other. Mr. Poe was waving his handkerchief in the air to signal a taxi to stop, and in no time at all the cab driver piled all of the Baudelaire suitcases into the trunk, and Mr. Poe piled the Baudelaire children into the back seat. "I will say goodbye to you here," said Mr. Poe. "The banking day has already begun, and I'm afraid if I go with you out to Aunt Josephine's, I will never get anything done. Please give her my best wishes, and tell her that I will keep in touch regularly." Mr. Poe paused for a moment to cough into his handkerchief before continuing. "Now, your Aunt Josephine is a bit nervous about having 3 children in our house, but I assured her that you 3 were very well behaved. Make sure you mind your manners, and, as always, you can call or fax me at the bank if there's any sort of problem, although I don't imagine anything will go wrong this time." When Mr. Poe said, "this time," he looked at the children meaningfully, as if it were their fault that poor Uncle Monty was dead. But the Baudelaires were too nervous about meeting their new caretaker to say anything more to Mr. Poe, except, "So long." "So long," Violet said, putting the bag of peppermints in her pocket. "So long," Claus said, taking one last look at the debacle sack. "Fool!" Sunny shrieked, chewing on her seatbelt buckle. "So long," Mr. Poe replied, "and good luck to you. I will think of the Baudelaires as often as I can." Mr. Poe gave some money to the taxi driver and waved goodbye to the 3 children, as the cab pulled away from the dock and onto a gray cobblestone street. There was a small grocery store with barrels of limes and beets out front. There was a clothing store called Look, It Fits, which appeared to be undergoing renovations. There was a terrible-looking restaurant called The Anxious Clown, with neon lights and balloons in the window. But mostly, there were many stores and shops that were all closed up, with boards or metal gratings over the windows and doors. "This town doesn't seem very crowded," Claus remarked. "I was hoping we might make some new friends here." "It's the off-season," the cab driver said. He was a skinny man with a skinny cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and as he talked to the children, he looked at them through the rearview mirror. "The town of Lake Lachrymose is a resort, and when the nice weather comes, it's as crowded as can be. But around now, things here are as dead as the cat I ran over this morning. Yikes! To make new friends, you'll have to wait until the weather gets a little better. Speaking of which, Hurricane Herman is expected to arrive in town in a week or so. You better make sure you have enough food up there in the house." "A hurricane on a lake?" Claus asked. "I thought hurricanes only occurred near the ocean." "A body of water as big as Lake Lachrymose," the driver said, "can have anything occur on it. To tell you the truth, I'd be a little nervous about living on top of this hill. Once the storm hits, it will be very difficult to drive all the way down into town." Violet, Claus, and Sunny looked out the window and saw what the driver meant by all the way down. The taxi had turned one last corner and arrived at the scraggly top of a tall hill, and the children could see the town far, far below them. The cobblestone road curling around the buildings like a tiny gray snake, and the small square of Democles Dock with specks of people bustling around it. And out behind the dock was the inky blob of Lake Lachrymose, huge and dark as if a monster were standing over the 3 orphans, casting a giant shadow below them. For a few moments the children stared into the lake as if hypnotized by the enormous stain on the landscape. "The lake is enormous," Claus said, "and it looks so deep. I can almost understand why Aunt Josephine is afraid of it." "The lady who lives up here," the cab driver asked, "is afraid of the lake?" "That's what we've been told," Violet said. The cab driver shook his head and brought the cab to a halt. "I don't know how she can stand it, then." "What do you mean?" Violet asked. "You mean you've never been to this house?" he asked. "No, never," Claus replied. "We've never even met our Aunt Josephine before." "Well, if your Aunt Josephine is afraid of water," the cab driver said, "I can't believe she lives here in this house." "What are you talking about?" Claus asked. "Well, take a look," the driver answered and got out of the cab. The Baudelaires took a look. At first the 3 youngsters saw only a small boxy square with a peeling white door, and it looked as if the house was scarcely bigger than the taxi, which had taken them to it. But as they piled out of the car and drew closer, they saw that this small square was only part of the house that was on top of the hill. The rest of it, a large pile of boxy squares, all stuck together like ice cubes, hung over the side, attached to the hill by long metal stilts that looked like spider legs. As the three orphans peered down at their new home, it seemed as if the entire house were holding on to the hill for dear life. The taxi driver took their suitcases out of the trunk, set them in front of the peeling white door, and drove down the hill with a toot of his horn for a goodbye. There was a soft squeak as the peeling white door opened, and from behind the door appeared a pale woman with her white hair piled on top of her head in a bun. "Hello," she said, smiling thinly. "I'm your Aunt Josephine." "Hello," Violet said cautiously, and stepped forward to meet her new guardian. Claus stepped forward behind her, and Sunny crawled forward behind him. But all three Baudelaires were walking carefully, as if their weight would send the house toppling down from its perch. The orphans couldn't help wondering how a woman who was afraid of Lake Lachrymose could live in a house that felt like it was about to fall into its depths. Chapter 2. There's the picture. Chapter 2. "This is the radiator," Aunt Josephine said, pointing to a radiator with a pale and skinny finger. "Please don't ever touch it. You may find yourself very cold here in my home. I never turn on the radiator because I am frightened that it might explode, so often it's chilly in the evenings." Violet and Claus looked at one another briefly, and Sunny looked at both of them. Aunt Josephine was giving them a tour of their new home, and so far appeared to be afraid of everything in it. From the welcome mat, which Aunt Josephine explained could cause someone to trip and break their neck, to the sofa in the living room, which you could fall over at any time and crush them flat. "This is a telephone," Aunt Josephine said, gesturing to the telephone. "It should be used in emergencies, because there's a danger of electrocution." "Actually," Claus said, "I've read quite a bit about electricity. I'm pretty sure that the telephone is perfectly safe." Aunt Josephine's hands fluttered to her white hair as if something had jumped onto her head. "You can't believe everything you read," she pointed out. "I built a telephone from scratch," Violet said. "If you'd like, I'd take the phone apart and show you how it works. That might make you feel better." "I don't think so," Aunt Josephine said, frowning. "Delmo," Sunny offered, which probably meant something along the lines of, "If you wish, I will bite the telephone to show you that it's harmless." "Delmo?" Aunt Josephine asked, bending over to pick up a piece of flint from the faded flowery carpet. "What do you mean by Delmo?" "I consider myself to be an expert on the English language, and I have no idea what the word Delmo means. She's speaking some other language." "Sunny doesn't speak fluently yet, I'm afraid," Claus said, picking up his little sister. "Just baby talk, mostly." "Grun!" Sunny shrieked, which meant something like, "I object to your calling it baby talk." "Well, I will have to teach her proper English," Aunt Josephine said stiffly. "I'm sure you all need some brushing up on your grammar, actually. Grammar is the greatest joy in life, don't you find?" The three siblings looked at one another. Violet was more likely to say that inventing things was the greatest joy in life. Claus thought reading was, and Sunny, of course, took no greater pleasure than in biting things. The Baudelaires thought of grammar, all those rules about how to write and speak the English language, the way they thought of banana bread. Fine, but nothing to make a fuss about. Still, it seemed rude to contradict Aunt Josephine. "Yes," Violet said finally, "we've always loved grammar." Aunt Josephine nodded and gave the Baudelaires a small smile. "Well, I'll show you to your room and continue the rest of the tour after dinner. When you open this door, just push on the wood here. Never use the doorknob. I'm always afraid that it will shatter into a million pieces and that one of them will hit my eye." That's a little silly. Baudelaires were beginning to think that they would not be allowed to touch a single object in the whole house, but they smiled at Aunt Josephine, pushed on the wood, and opened the door to reveal a large, well-lit room with blank white walls and a plain blue carpet on the floor. Inside were 2 good-sized beds and 1 good-sized crib, obviously for Sunny, each covered in a plain blue bedspread. At the front foot of each bed was a large trunk for storing things. At the other end of the room was a large closet for everyone's clothes, a small window for looking out, and a medium-sized pile of tin cans for no apparent reason. "I'm sorry that all 3 of you have to share a room," Aunt Josephine said, "but this house isn't very big. I've tried to provide you with everything you would need, and I do hope you will be comfortable." "I'm sure we will," Violet said, carrying her suitcase into the room. "Thank you very much, Aunt Josephine." "In each of your trunks," Aunt Josephine said, "there's a present." Presents? The Baudelaires had not received presents for a long, long time. Smiling, Aunt Josephine walked to the first trunk and opened it. "For Violet," she said. There is a lovely new doll with plenty of outfits for it to wear. Aunt Josephine reached inside and pulled out a plastic doll with a tiny mouth and wide, staring eyes. Isn't she adorable? Her name is Pretty Penny. Oh, thank you, said Violet, who at 14 years old was too old for dolls, and had never particularly liked dolls anyways. Forcing a smile on her face, she took Pretty Penny from Aunt Josephine and patted it on its plastic head. And for Claus, Aunt Josephine said, there's a model train set. She opened the second trunk and pulled out a tiny train car. You can set up the tracks in that empty corner of the room. What fun, said Claus, trying to look excited. Claus had never really liked model trains, as they were a lot of work to put together, and when you were done, all you had was something that went around and around in endless circles. And for little Sonny, Aunt Josephine said, reaching into the smallest trunk, which sat at the foot of the crib, here's a rattle. See, Sonny, it makes a little noise. Sonny smiled at Aunt Josephine, showing all four of her sharp teeth, but her older siblings knew that Sonny despised rattles and the irritating sounds they made when you shook them. Sonny had been given a rattle when she was very small, and it was the only thing she was not sorry to lose in the enormous fire that had destroyed the Baudelaire home. It is so generous of you, Violet said, to give us all of these things. She was too polite to add that they weren't things they particularly liked. Well, I am very happy to have you here, Aunt Josephine said. I love grammar so much. I'm excited to be able to share my love of grammar with 3 nice children, like yourselves. Well, I'll give you a few minutes to settle in, and then we'll have some dinner. See you soon. Aunt Josephine, Claus asked, what are these cans for? Those cans? For burglars, naturally. Aunt Josephine said, putting the bun of her hair on top of her head. You must be as frightened of burglars as I am, so every night simply please place these tin cans right by the door. So when burglars come in, they'll trip over the cans and wake you up. But what will we do then when we're awake in a room with an angry burglar? Violet asked. I would prefer to sleep through a burglary. Aunt Josephine's eyes grew wide with fear. Angry burglars, she repeated. Angry burglars? Why are you talking about angry burglars? Are you trying to make us all even more frightened than we already are? Of course not, Violet shuddered, not pointing out that Aunt Josephine was the one who had brought up the subject. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you. Well, we'll say no more about that, Aunt Josephine said, looking nervously at the tin cans, as if a burglar were tripping over them at any minute. At this very minute. I'll see you at the dinner table in a few minutes. Their new guardian shut the door, and the Baudelaire orphans listened to her footsteps, padding down the hallway before they spoke. Sonny can have Pretty Penny, Violet said, handing the doll to her sister. The plastic is hard enough for chewing, I think. And you can have the model trains, Violet. Claus said, maybe you could take apart the engines and invent something. But that leaves you with the rattle, Violet. Violet said, that doesn't seem fair. Shoo! Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something along the lines of, it's been a long time since anything in our lives has felt fair. The Baudelaires looked at one another with bitter smiles. Sonny was right. It wasn't fair that their parents had been taken away from them. It wasn't fair that the evil and revolting Count Olaf was pursuing them wherever they went, caring for nothing but their fortune. It wasn't fair that they moved from relative to relative, with terrible things happening at each of their new homes, as if the Baudelaires were riding on some horrible bus that stopped only at stations of unfairness and misery. And of course, it certainly wasn't fair that Claus only had a rattle to play with in his new home. Aunt Josephine obviously worked very hard to prepare this room for us, Violet said. She seems to be a good-hearted person. We shouldn't complain, even to ourselves. You're right, Claus said, picking up the rattle and giving it a half-hearted little shake. We shouldn't complain. Twee! Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something like, both of you are right, we shouldn't complain. Claus walked over to the window and looked out at the darkening landscape. The sun was beginning to set over the inky depths of Lake Lachrymose, and a cold evening wind was beginning to blow. Even from the other side of the glass, Claus could feel a small chill. I want to complain anyway, he said. Soup's on, Aunt Josephine called from the kitchen. Please come to dinner. Violet put her hand on Claus's shoulder and gave it a little squeeze of comfort, and without another word, the 3 Baudelaires headed back down the hallway and into the dining room. Aunt Josephine had set the table for 4, providing a large cushion for Sonny and another pile of tin cans in the corner of the room, just in case the burglars tried to steal their dinner. Normally, of course, Aunt Josephine said, soup's on, is an idiomatic expression that has nothing to do with soup. It simply means that dinner is ready. In this case, however, I've actually made soup. Oh, good, Violet said. There's nothing like hot soup on a chilly evening. Actually, it's not hot soup, Aunt Josephine said. I never cook anything hot because I'm afraid of turning the stove on. It might burst into flames. I've made chilled cucumber soup for dinner. The Baudelaires looked at one another and tried to hide their dismay. As you probably know, chilled cucumber soup is a delicacy that is best enjoyed on a very hot day. I myself once enjoyed it in Egypt while visiting a friend of mine who works as a snake charmer. When it is well prepared, chilled cucumber soup has a delicious minty taste, cool and refreshing, as if you were drinking something as well as eating it. But on a cold day in a drafty room, chilled cucumber soup is about as welcome as a swarm of wasps at a bat mitzvah. In dead silence, the three children sat down at the table with their Aunt Josephine and did their best to force down the cold, slimy concoction. The only sound was of Sunny's 4 teeth chattering on her soup spoon as she ate her frigid dinner. As I'm sure you know, when no one is speaking at the dinner table, the meal seems to take hours, so it felt like much, much later when Aunt Josephine broke the silence. My dear husband and I never had children, she said, because we were too afraid to. I do want to know that I'm very happy that you're here. I am often very lonely up on this hill by myself, and when Mr. Poe wrote to me about your troubles, I didn't want you to be as lonely as I was when I lost my dear Ike. Was Ike your husband? Violet asked. Aunt Josephine smiled, but she didn't look at Violet, as if she were talking to more herself than the Baudelaires. Yes, she said in a faraway voice. He was my husband, but he was much more than that. He was my best friend, my partner in grammar, and the only person I knew who could whistle with crackers in his mouth. Our mother could do that, Cluss said, smiling. Her specialty was Mozart's 14th Symphony. Ike's was Beethoven's 4th Quartet, Aunt Josephine replied. Apparently, it's family characteristic. I'm sorry we never got to meet him, Violet said. He sounds wonderful. He was wonderful, Aunt Josephine said, stirring her soup and blowing on it even though it was ice cold. I was so sad when he died. I felt like I'd lost the 2 most special things in my life. 2? What do you mean? I lost Ike, Aunt Josephine said, and I lost Lake Lachrymose. I mean, I didn't really lose it, of course. It's still down in the valley. But I grew up on its shores. I used to swim in it every day. I knew which beaches were sandy and which were rocky. I knew all the islands in the middle of its waters and all the caves along its shore. Lake Lachrymose felt like a friend to me. But when it took poor Ike away from me, I was too afraid to go near it any more. I stopped swimming in it. I never went to the beach again. I even put away all my books about it. The only way I can bear to look at it is from the wide window in the library. Library? Claus asked, brightening. You have a library? Of course, Aunt Josephine said, or else would I keep all my books on grammar? If you've finished with your soup, I'll show you the library. I couldn't eat another bite, Violet said truthfully. Sunny shrieked in agreement. No, Aunt Josephine said. Is not grammatically correct. You mean to say I have also finished my supper. Sunny insisted. My goodness, you do need grammar lessons, Aunt Josephine said. All the more reason to go to the library. Come, children. Leaving behind their half-full soup bowls, the Baudelaires followed Aunt Josephine down the hallway, taking care not to touch any of the doorknobs they passed. At the end of the hallway, Aunt Josephine stopped and opened an ordinary-looking door, but when the children stepped through the door, they arrived in a room that was anything but ordinary. The library was neither square nor rectangle, like most rooms, but curved in the shape of an oval. One wall of the oval was devoted to books, rows and rows and rows of them, and every single one of them was about grammar. There was an encyclopedia of nouns placed in a series of simple wooden bookshelves, curved to fit the wall. There were very thin books on the history of verbs, lined up in metal bookshelves that were polished to a bright shine, and there were cabinets made of glass, with adjective manuals placed inside them as if they were for sale in a store instead of in someone's house. In the middle of the room were some comfortable-looking chairs, each with its own footstool, so one could stretch out one's legs while reading. But it was the other wall of the oval at the far end of the room that drew the children's attention. From floor to ceiling, the wall was a window, just one enormous curved pane of glass, and beyond the glass was a spectacular view of Lake Lachrymose. When the children stepped forward to take a closer look, they felt as they were flying high above the dark lake instead of merely looking out on it. This is the only way I can stand to look at the lake, Aunt Josephine said in a quiet voice. From far away. If I get much closer, I remember my last picnic on the beach with my darling Ike. I warned him to wait another hour before eating before he went to the lake, but he only waited 45 minutes. He thought that was enough. Did he get cramps? Claus asked. That's what's supposed to happen if you don't wait an hour before you swim. That's one reason, Aunt Josephine said. But in Lake Lachrymose, there's another one. If you don't wait an hour before eating, the lachrymose leeches will smell food on you and attack. Ah, leeches? Violet asked. Leeches, Claus explained, are a bit like worms. They are blind and live in bodies of water, and in order to feed, they attach themselves to you and suck your blood. Violet shuddered. How horrible. Chwa! Sunny shrieked, which probably meant something along the lines of, why in the world would you go swimming in a lake full of leeches? Agreed. The lachrymose leeches, Aunt Josephine said, are quite different from regular leeches. They have 6 rows of very sharp teeth and 1 very sharp nose. They can even smell the smallest bit of food from far, far away. The lachrymose leeches are usually quite harmless, preying only on small fish. But if they smell food on a human, they will swarm around him, and tears came to Aunt Josephine's eyes, and she took out a pale pink handkerchief and dabbed them away. I apologize, children. It is not grammatically correct to end a sentence with the word and, but I get so upset when I think about Ike that I cannot talk about his death. We're sorry we brought it up, Claus said quickly. We didn't mean to upset you. That's all right, Aunt Josephine said, blowing her nose. It's just that I prefer to think of Ike in other ways. Ike always loved the sunshine, and I like to imagine that wherever he is now, it's as sunny as can be. Of course, nobody knows what happens to you after you die, but it's nice to think of my husband someplace very, very hot, don't you think? Yes, I do, Violet said. It is very nice. She swallowed. She wanted to say something else to Aunt Josephine, but when you only have known someone for a few hours, it is difficult to know what they would like to hear. Aunt Josephine, she said timidly, have you ever thought of moving someplace else? Perhaps if you lived somewhere far from Lake Lachrymose, you might feel better. We'd go with you, Claus piped up. Oh, I could never sell this house, Aunt Josephine said. I'm terrified of realtors. The 3 Baudelaire youngsters looked at one another surreptitiously, a word which here means while Aunt Josephine wasn't looking. None of them had ever heard of a person who was frightened of realtors. There are 2 kinds of fears, rational and irrational, or in simpler terms, fears that make sense and fears that don't. For instance, the Baudelaire orphans have a fear of Count Olaf, which makes perfect sense, because he is an evil man who wants to destroy him. But if they were afraid of lemon meringue pie, this would be an irrational fear, because lemon meringue pie is delicious and would never hurt a soul. Being afraid of a monster under the bed is perfectly rational, because there may in fact be a monster under your bed at any time, ready to eat you up. But a fear of realtors is an irrational fear. Realtors, as I'm sure you know, are people who assist in buying and selling of houses. Besides, occasionally wearing an ugly yellow coat, the worst a realtor can do is show you a house that you find ugly, and it is so completely irrational to be terrified of them. As Violet, Claus, and Sunny looked down at the dark lake and thought about their new lives with Aunt Josephine, they experienced a fear themselves, and even a worldwide expert on fear would have difficulty saying whether this is a rational fear or an irrational fear. The Baudelaire's fears was that misfortune would soon befall them. On one hand, this was an irrational fear, because Aunt Josephine seemed like a good person, and Count Olaf was nowhere to be seen. But on the other hand, the Baudelaires had experienced so many terrible things that it seemed rational to think that another catastrophe was just around the corner. Chapter 3. Here's the picture. It says, Captain Sham's sailboats. Every boat has its own sail. Chapter 3. There's a way of looking at life called keeping things in perspective. This simply means making yourself feel better about comparing the things that are happening to you right now against other things that have happened at a different time or to other people. For instance, if you are upset about an ugly pimple on the end of your nose, you might try to feel better by keeping your pimple in perspective. You might compare your pimple situation to that of someone who is being eaten by a bear. And when you looked in the mirror at your ugly pimple, you might say to yourself, but at least I'm not being eaten by an ugly bear. Or by a regular bear. You can see at once why keeping things in perspective rarely works very well, because it's hard to concentrate on somebody else being eaten by a bear when you are staring at your own ugly pimple. So it was with the Baudelaire orphans in the days that followed. In the morning, when the children joined Aunt Josephine for a breakfast of orange juice and untoasted bread, Violet thought of herself, well, at least we're not being forced to cook for Count Olaf's disgusting theater troupe. In the afternoon, when Aunt Josephine would take them to the library and teach them all about grammar, Claus thought to himself, well, at least Count Olaf isn't about to whisk us away to Peru. And in the evening, when the children joined Aunt Josephine for a dinner of orange juice and untoasted bread, Sunny thought of herself, Zax, which meant something along the lines of, well, at least there isn't a sign of Count Olaf anywhere. But no matter how much the three siblings compared their life with Aunt Josephine to the miserable things that had happened to them before, they couldn't help but be dissatisfied with their circumstances. In her free time, Violet would dismantle the gears and switches from the model train set, hoping to invent something that could prepare hot food without frightening Aunt Josephine, but she couldn't help wishing that Aunt Josephine would simply turn on the stove. Claus would sit in one of the chairs in the library with his feet on a footstool, reading about grammar until the sun went down. But he would look out at the gloomy lake. He couldn't help wishing that they were still living in Uncle Monty and all his reptiles. And Sunny would take time out from her schedule and bite the head of Pretty Penny, but she couldn't help wishing that their parents were still alive and that she and her siblings were safe and sound in the Baudelaire home. Aunt Josephine did not like to leave the house very much, because there were so many things outside that frightened her. But one day the children told her that what the cab driver had said about Hurricane Herman approaching, and she agreed to take them into town in order to buy groceries. Aunt Josephine was afraid to drive automobiles because the doors might get stuck, leaving her trapped inside, so they walked the long way down the hill. By the time the Baudelaires reached the market, their legs were sore from the walk. Are you sure that you won't let us cook for you? Violet said, as Aunt Josephine reached into the barrel of limes. When we lived with Count Olaf, we learned how to make puttanesca sauce. It is quite easy and perfectly safe. Aunt Josephine shook her head. It is my responsibility as your caretaker to cook for you, and I am eager to try this recipe for cold lime stew. Count Olaf certainly sounds evil. Imagine forcing children to stand near a stove. Aunt Josephine shook her head. He was very cruel to us, Claus agreed, not adding that being forced to cook had been the least of their problems when they lived with Count Olaf. Sometimes I still have nightmares about the terrible tattoo on his ankle. It always scared me. Aunt Josephine frowned and patted her bun. I'm afraid you made a grammatical mistake, Claus, she said sternly. When you said it always scared me, you sounded as if you meant that his ankle always scared you. But you meant his tattoo. So you should have said the tattoo always scared me. Do you understand? Yes, I understand, Claus said, sighing. Thank you for pointing that out, Aunt Josephine. Nickoo, Sunny shrieked, which probably meant something like, it wasn't very nice to point out Claus's, quote, grammatical mistake when he was talking about something that upset him. No, Sunny, Aunt Josephine said firmly, looking up from her shopping list. Nickoo isn't a word. Remember what we said about using correct English? Now, Violet, would you please get some cucumbers? I thought I'd make chilled cucumber soup again sometime next week. Violet groaned inwardly, a phrase which here means said nothing but felt disappointed at the prospect of another chilly dinner. But she smiled at Aunt Josephine and headed down an aisle of the market in search of cucumbers. She looked wistfully at all the delicious food on the shelves that required turning on the stove in order to prepare it. Violet hoped that someday she could cook a nice hot meal for Aunt Josephine and her siblings using the invention she was working on with the model train engine. For a few moments she was so lost in her inventing thoughts that she didn't look where she was going until she walked into someone. Excuse me, Violet started to say, but when she looked up she couldn't finish her sentence. There stood a tall, thin man with a blue sailor hat on his head and a black eye patch covering his left eye. He was smiling eagerly down at her as if she were a brightly wrapped birthday present that he couldn't wait to rip open. His fingers were long and bony, and he was leaning awkwardly to one side, a bit like Aunt Josephine's house dangling over the hill. When Violet looked down, she saw why. There was a thick stump of wood where his leg should have been, and like most people with peg legs, this man was leaning on his good leg, which caused him to tilt. But even though Violet had never seen anyone with a peg leg before, this was not why she couldn't finish her sentence. The reason why had to do with something she had seen before. The bright shine in the man's one eye, and above it, just one long eyebrow. When someone's in disguise, and the disguise is not very good, one can describe it as a transparent disguise. This does not mean that the person is wearing plastic wrap or glass or anything else transparent. It simply means that people can see through this disguise. That is, the disguise doesn't fool them for a minute. Violet wasn't fooled for even a second as she stood staring at the man she'd walked into. She knew at once it was Count Olaf. "Violet, what are you doing in this aisle?" Aunt Josephine said, walking up behind her. "This aisle contains food that needs to be heated. And you know—" When she saw Count Olaf, she stopped speaking for a second. Violet thought that Aunt Josephine had recognized him too. But then Aunt Josephine smiled, and Violet's hopes were dashed, a word which here means shattered. "Hello," Count Olaf said, smiling at Josephine. "I just wanted to apologize for running into your sister here." Aunt Josephine's face grew bright red, seeming even brighter under her white hair. "Oh, no," she said, as Claus and Sunny came down the aisle to see what the fuss was. "Violet is not my sister, sir. I am her legal guardian." Count Olaf clapped his one hand to his face as if Aunt Josephine had just told him she was the Tooth Fairy. "I can't believe it," he said. "Madam, you don't look nearly old enough to be anyone's guardian." Aunt Josephine blushed again. "Well, sir, I have lived by the lake my whole life, and some people have told me that it keeps me looking youthful. I would be happy to have the acquaintance of a local personage," Count Olaf said, tipping his blue sailor hat and using a silly word which here means person. "I am new to this town and beginning a new business, so I'm eager to make new acquaintances. Allow me to introduce myself." "Claus and I are happy to introduce you," Violet said, with more bravery than I would have had when faced with meeting Count Olaf. "Aunt Josephine, this is Count—" No, Violet," Aunt Josephine interrupted. "Watch your grammar. You should have said, Claus and I will be happy to introduce you, because you haven't introduced us yet." "But," Violet started to say. "Now, Veronica," Count Olaf said, with his one eye shining brightly as he looked down at her. Your guardian is right. And before you make any other mistakes, allow me to introduce myself. I am Captain Sham, and I have a new business renting sailboats out on DeMockle's dock. I am happy to make your acquaintance, Miss—" "I am Josephine Anwhistle," Aunt Josephine said, "and these are Violet, Claus, and little Sunny Baudelaire." "Little Sunny," Captain Sham repeated, sounding as if he were eating Sunny rather than greeting her. "It's a pleasure to meet all of you. Perhaps some day I can take you out on a lake for a little boat ride." "Ging!" Sunny shrieked, which probably meant something like, "I would rather eat dirt." "We're not going to be going anywhere with you," Claus said. Aunt Josephine blushed again and looked sharply at the three children. The children seemed to forget their manners as well as their grammar. "Please apologize to Captain Sham at once." "He's not Captain Sham," Violet said impatiently. "He's Count Olaf." Aunt Josephine gasped and looked from the anxious faces of the Baudelaires to the calm face of Captain Sham. He had a grin on his face, but his smile had slipped a notch, phrase which here means grown less confident as he waited to see if Aunt Josephine realized he really was Count Olaf in disguise. Aunt Josephine looked him over from head to toe and then frowned. "Mr. Poe told me to be on the watch for Count Olaf," she said finally, "but he did also say that you children tended to see him everywhere." "We see him everywhere," Claus said tartly, "because he is everywhere." "That's true." "Who is this Count Olaf person?" Captain Sham asked. "Count Olaf, Aunt Josephine, is a terrible man who is standing right in front of us," Violet finished. "I don't care what he calls himself. He has the same shiny eyes, the same single eyebrow." "Well, plenty of people have those characteristics," Aunt Josephine said. "Why, my mother-in-law had not only one eyebrow, but also had only had one ear." The tattoo," Claus said. "Look for the tattoo. Count Olaf has a tattoo of an eye on his left ankle." Captain Sham sighed and with difficulty lifted his peg leg so everyone could get a clear look at it. It was made of dark wood and was polished to shine as brightly as his eye and attached to his left knee with a curved metal hinge. "But I don't have a left ankle," he said in a whiny voice. "It was all chewed away by the lachrymose leeches." Aunt Josephine's eyes welled up, and she placed a hand on Captain Sham's shoulder. "Oh, you poor man," she said. And the children knew at once they were doomed. "Did you hear what Captain Sham said?" she asked them. Violet tried one more time, knowing it would probably be futile, a word which here means filled with futility. "He's not Captain Sham," she said. "You don't think he would allow the lachrymose leeches to chew off his leg?" Aunt Josephine said, "Just to play a prank on you. Tell us, Captain Sham, tell us how it happened." "Well, I was sitting in my boat just a few weeks ago," Captain Sham said. "I was eating some pasta with puttanesca sauce, and I spilled some on my leg. Before I knew it, the leeches were attacking." That's just how it happened with my husband, Aunt Josephine said, biting her lip. The Baudelaires, all three of them, clenched their fists in frustration. They knew that Captain Sham's... Excuse me. They knew that Captain Sham's story about the puttanesca sauce was as phony as his name, but they couldn't prove it. Here, Captain Sham said, pulling a small card out of his pocket and handing it to Aunt Josephine. Take my business card. Excuse me. The next time you're in town, perhaps we could enjoy a cup of tea. That sounds delightful, Aunt Josephine said, reading his card. Captain Sham's sailboats. Every boat has its own sail. Oh, Captain, you have made a very serious grammatical error here. What? Captain Sham said, raising his eyebrow. The card says it's with an apostrophe. I-T'-S. Always means it is. You don't mean to say every boat has its own sail. You simply mean it's belonging to it. It is a very common mistake, Captain Sham, but a dreadful one. Captain Sham's face darkened, and it looked for a minute like he was going to raise his peg leg again and kick Aunt Josephine with all his might. But then he smiled and his face cleared. Thank you for pointing that out, he said finally. You're welcome, Aunt Josephine said. Come, children, it's time to pay for our groceries. I hope to see you soon, Captain Sham. Captain Sham smiled and waved goodbye, but the Baudelaires watched his smile turned into a sneer as soon as Aunt Josephine had turned her back. He had fooled her, and there was nothing the Baudelaires could do about it. They spent the rest of the afternoon trudging back to the hill carrying her groceries, and the heaviness of cucumbers and limes was nothing compared to the heaviness in the orphan's heart. All the way up the hill, Aunt Josephine talked about Captain Sham and what a nice man he was, and how much she hoped they would see him again, while the children knew he really was Count Olaf, and a terrible man, and hoped they would never see him again for the rest of their lives. Can't turn the page. There we go. There's an expression that, I am sad to say, is appropriate for this part of the story. The expression is falling for something, hook, line, and sinker, and it comes from the world of fishing. The hook, the line, and the sinker are all parts of a fishing rod, and they work together to lure fish out of the ocean into their doom. If somebody is falling for something, hook, line, and sinker, they are believing a bunch of lies, and they may find themselves doomed as a result. Aunt Josephine was falling for Captain Sham's lies, hook, line, and sinker, but it was Violet, Claus, and Sunny who were feeling doomed. As they walked up the hill in silence, the children looked down at Lake Lachrymose and felt the chill of doom fall over their hearts. It made the three siblings feel cold and lost, as if they were simply looking at a shadowy lake, but had been dropped into the middle of its depths. Chapter 4 next time.